Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you for joining us here for today's webinar of Kitchen Botany, brought to you by our botanical educator, James Stevenson. My name is Christy Nicola. I'm a staff member here at Weedon Island's Cultural and Natural History Center, and I'm super excited to get cooking with knowledge with James. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and go over a few things. We're going to have some polls during our time here today, one at the beginning right now and one at the end of our webinar. I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll question. It's just to see if any other additional people are watching with you here today. If it's just you, you can go ahead and reflect that as 0. But if you're watching with 2 friends, you can go ahead and reflect their presence as the number 2. And I'll give everybody a few moments to finish up this first poll. And while we're waiting, if you guys have any questions about today's presentation, anything you would like to ask James about the topic of today's webinar, please feel free to utilize our Q&A portion of our Zoom application. This should be located at the bottom of your screen. James will go over all the questions at the end of today's webinar, so make sure you stick around for that. And I'm going to go ahead and end this poll right now. Thank you all for your participation. If you have any comments or concerns, feel free to drop those in our chat box. And let's go ahead and get started. Back to you, James.
Well, thank you very much, Christy. And thank you all for joining us this week. It's a special week, the week before Thanksgiving, 2024. And as Christy was mentioning, my name is James, and I am with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, your extension services here in Pinellas County. Strangely, though, even though I work for the extension services, I don't know how to grow vegetables, and I don't know how to cook vegetables. My role in IFAS Extension here in Pinellas County is to interpret the natural world, the world that we see around us in our natural areas, including places like our preserves. Weedon Island and Brooker Creek are the 2 largest preserves in the county, and this is land that's been set aside especially to preserve our native plants and animals. And we interpret these things to bring people closer to the natural world, give them more of an impetus to protect and care about the natural world. And one of my remits is to explain botany. And I have taught an advanced plant identification class, and plant identification is a very interesting subject, and it's a very popular class to take, and we'll talk about that class later on in this presentation. Some of the feedback that we got was initially people were afraid to sign up because they thought it was just too daunting, that plants are just too mysterious, there's too many of them, and it's too hard. So we created this presentation, number 1, to be entertaining, number 2, to be educational, and number 3, to kind of break down the barriers between people and plants, to get you to realize how much you already know, just by virtue of the fact that you eat plants and you handle plants in the kitchen, in the preparation of food. So this class draws a line between humans and plants through something that we all do, which is eat. So that's kind of the premise of today's presentation. So botany, of course, is the study of plants, and I am lucky enough to have made a career out of studying and interpreting plants for people. There is a difference between botany and horticulture. Horticulture is, of course, the care and feeding, the rearing, the nurturing of plants. That's one aspect of working with plants. Botany is more of the umbrella, more of the science. There are botanists that have never been outside before. They might just study one particular compound that's isolated from one plant. So botany is a huge subject, and it covers, as you will find, many aspects of plants and their place in our world. So we'll take a look at plants writ large, and then we'll take a look at our relationship to plants and how, thanks to plants' very fluid and plastic genetics, humans have been able to take advantage of these things, the plastic genetics, the speed at which plants can reproduce, and we have taken advantage of plants' predilection to mutation. And we have taken these mutations straight to the kitchen and therefore into our tummies. And then, of course, speaking of tummies, we'll talk about the eating of these mutants. So I like to begin, usually, in interpreting a particular subject by getting the highest view possible. So let's, before we drill down in today's very granular subject, let's take a look at plants from the bigger scheme of things. And all the plants on Earth, there's about 400,000 different kinds of plants on Earth. And how we make sense of this huge number is, well, the most efficient way to make sense of this number is to break them down into some scientifically significant groups. And these groups are established based on the common characteristics that are shared amongst the members of that group. There are basically 4 big groups of plants. There's a group of plants called the mosses, not Spanish moss, but the little green velvet that grows on the forest floor or perhaps under the downspout of your house. These represent some of the very first land plants. They don't get very tall because they can't move water through their little tiny bodies. It's all osmosis. They don't have the plumbing that belong to some of the higher plants. Moving up in complexity, we have a group of plants, the second group, called the ferns. And you're probably familiar with ferns. And that group is just like the mosses. The ferns are unique amongst themselves, and they belong in a single group. All the ferns belong in this separate and singular group because they have the plumbing, but their reproductive strategy is what holds this group together. They still reproduce by spores, just like the mosses do, but they have vasculature. So the mosses are all unique amongst themselves, the ferns unique amongst themselves. Moving up in complexity, we come to a group of non-flowering plants called the conifers. And these all share a reproductive strategy, the cone. And this includes the pine trees, the junipers, and the cycads. The largest group of plants on Earth are the flowering plants. That's everything else, everything you see out there. Oak trees, grasses, palm trees, the bedding plants in your planting scheme, those are flowering plants. And the majority of vegetables, too, are flowering plants. The mosses, the ferns, and the conifers are not very well represented in the kitchen. We're going to focus today mainly on the most familiar fruits and vegetables from the Western diet, because that's the one that I know the most about. And they belong to this 4th group, the flowering plants. And then the flowering plants can be subdivided into 2 pretty unique groups that all share similarities. These are called monocots and eudicots. I hope you're still with me. We're just going to race through a little bit more botany. Among the flowering plants, those are broken into 2 groups. And then those groups are subdivided yet again into groups that we call families. And there is a group of flowering plants within the subset monocot called the onion family. And in that family, we have onions and garlic and leeks. I'm pretty sure you get that these things are related. They have sulfurous compounds, among other things, that kind of indicate that they share a common ancestor. They're put together the same way, just like, members of your family represent, or excuse me, resemble each other. Within this group of flowering plants, the monocots, we also have the asparagus family, and that includes asparagus. It also includes catbrier or smilax, and it also includes that landscape plant called asparagus fern, which isn't a fern at all. It's a flowering plant. It's a asparagus. It's in the genus asparagus, in fact, but we don't eat it. Another monocot family of flowering plants are the grasses. And within the grasses, we have different genera like the genus of corn, the genus of wheat, and the genus of sandspurs, and of course the genus of St. Augustine grass. Those all belong within the same family, within this group of flowering plants called the monocots. The other and larger group of flowering plants are the eudicots or the dicots. And there's a family within that group that gives us quite a lot of kitchen botany, the Brassicaceae, the crucifers, the cruciferous vegetables. They belong to the same family, the Brassicaceae. And that's cabbage and Brussels sprouts and kale, and a funny flowering plant called cleome, spider flower, if you've ever grown that. That belongs. So not everything in the Brassicaceae belongs in the kitchen. Not everything in the Poaceae belongs in the kitchen. And as we've seen, these are larger groups with many members, some of which are represented in the kitchen. Another couple of families, the Apiaceae, very fragrant family, cilantro, parsley, cumin, carrots, and poison hemlock. And the Asteraceae gives us things like lettuce, sunflowers, and artichoke heart. So just so you understand that we classify plants by their morphology. Their morphology speaks to their relationship to one another that is bestowed upon them from a common ancestor that goes back millions of years. And what we have done to modern species is that we have taken advantage of or intentionally created mutations, and we have exaggerated wild plants into things that we can and do consume. Now, no matter what we're talking about, no matter what kind of plant we're talking about, if it's a moss, a fern, a conifer, or a flowering plant, the plant body is basically made of the same organs, especially when we get into the higher plants like the ferns and the conifers and the flowering plants. Those organs are made of tissues, and the tissues are made of cells. Does any of this sound familiar? Major plant organs are, just like we have organs, lungs, heart, brain, plants have organs like roots, stems, and leaves. And no matter what kind of plant you're talking about, the roots serve one function, the stem serves a particular function, and the leaves serve a particular function. Just like the aardvark's lungs serve the same function as the human lungs, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take these various organs and we are going to examine what humans have done to take advantage of what these organs are designed to do for the plant and how we have co-opted that for our own purposes. We'll start from the ground up, a good way to start. Then we'll start with the roots. And of course, plant roots are used by the plant primarily to anchor them to the ground. It's not unimportant to note that plants are rooted to the ground and they are sedentary. They can't escape. They have to defend themselves where they stand. And there's plenty of things. We're not the only things on Earth that want to eat plants. Plants are the primary producers. They take sunlight and air and turn it into sugar. That's magic. And they turn it into the sugar that fuels all animals. So plants are sedentary, they're stuck to the ground, and they are usually stuck to the ground by their roots. So roots serve a very important function of anchorage. They also serve an incredibly important role of absorbing nutrients and water, water being a very critical part to a plant's life. Roots can also, and very often are, pressed into service to store some of the sugars that are produced by those parts of the plant that are exposed to light. You make a little bit too much sugar, you store it so you can use it later in times of lean. So roots are a very good place for plants to store things. Not only are they protected from predators underground, but they can spend an unfavorable season protected from the elements underground. A dry season or a cold season. Underground is a great place to store nutrients for use the following year. And early humans discovered by digging up, that plants will store carbohydrates underground. Carbohydrate is sugar that is changed into a form of starch. So it's sugar that's modified into a substance that is more stable and longer lasting. And radish is a classic storage root. Some plants, especially in the temperate region, excuse me, not the tropics, but in the temperate region, they have a winter that needs to be dealt with. And so sugars from the summer are stored as carbohydrate underground, and then those reserves are tapped into for the plant to grow the following spring, at which time there's using that stored energy, that plant can then flower and reproduce itself. So 1 year storing up that nice supply of carbohydrates, the following year using that storage to flower and reproduce. And then oftentimes that plant will die. That's why autumn is very often this harvest season, because plants have stored up everything that they're going to use over the winter or in the following spring. Humans then take all that for our own. Radishes, modern radish cultivars, can be grown anytime. Anytime you have a seed, you can grow a radish. And radishes grow pretty quickly. So radishes have historically been a very important food. You can see in this exaggerated form of the wild Raphanus sativus, all that wonderful white carbohydrate, all that starch, all that modified sugar that's just there ready for the plant to use the following year, or for humans to use our digestive enzymes to break those carbohydrates down into sugars that are then made available to our cells. Radish belongs to that cruciferous vegetable family, the Brassicaceae. They're called crucifers because their little flowers are in the shape of a cross. So crucifer means cross-bearing. All the members of the Brassicaceae have these, X or T or cross-shaped flowers. They are the Brassicaceae, or the crucifers. Raphanus is the name that the early peoples around the Mediterranean referred to this plant. So we just borrowed that from what they called it. And sativus means you can eat it. It satiates you. It sates an appetite. Sativus. Wild radish, of course, comes from this wild form. You might recognize the familial resemblance that occurs within the Brassicaceae that this plant belongs to. Can you see how the leaves look a bit like collard greens or kale? Because it's related. It's in the same family. It has a common ancestor. In this particular species, this plant uses its roots for storage, and we have in turn taken that to our advantage, and we steal that carbohydrate. Another famous autumn root vegetable, the parsnip. And the parsnip is not a cruciferous vegetable. It's named pastinaca. again, borrowed from the ancient peoples around the Mediterranean, and sativa again, because it satiates hunger, Pastinaca sativa. If you look at the leaves of this parsnip, maybe you can imagine who or what it might be related to just based on the morphology of the leaves. Do the leaves remind you something of carrot leaves? Does it remind you something of parsley or cilantro? Because parsnip belongs to that family, the Apiaceae, the parsley family. And within the Apiaceae, we have all those things that I just mentioned, carrots, parsley, and cilantro. There's also plenty of members that we don't mess with in the kitchen. We've got poison hemlock in the Apiaceae. The beetroot, our third root that we'll look at, Beta vulgaris. Vulgaris usually meaning the wild type. So here's what you might find if you were one of these ancient people meandering around the Mediterranean, stumbling over this swollen storage root, discovering that it didn't kill someone else who tried it, and in fact satiated a hunger, and the beetroot was taken into cultivation and turned into, through mutation and through growing and through cultivation, quite a few other things. So the beetroot, a classic storage root that we have pressed into service. The sea beet is kind of what our ancestors would have stumbled over and discovered with this storage root. From the same plant, the sea beet, humans in the process and act of cultivation discovered certain mutations and took advantage of some of those mutations. There was a Beta vulgaris that became extraordinarily leafy, and those leaves were palatable. They didn't have as much fiber or surface topography like spines or hairs or any protective structures like that on the leaves. That's where we got chard. Sugar beet. Humans found a certain population of beets that were extraordinarily, they had not just carbohydrate in their roots, but literal sugar. And took advantage of that, exaggerated that, and created most of the sugar that's eaten in Europe doesn't come from cane. Doesn't come from sugar cane. It comes from sugar beets. And it comes from these very things that are related to the original sea beet. Also within this family, flowering plants, the Amaranthaceae, we have spinach, and amaranth quinoa belongs in this family. That's a seed that we get from this particular flowering plant family. And all these mutations that I mentioned, they may have occurred naturally, just a literal rearrangement of the DNA of a particular plant that was growing in a field that was noticed by a keen-eyed human, and that was then taken advantage of. That natural mutation was then taken advantage of and exaggerated. It was amplified through cultivation. Maybe these plants were then isolated, so they would only breed with themselves, and they would only pass the mutation that was favorable amongst its offspring, like those soft, palatable leaves in the case of chard. Those mutations are sometimes called selections, especially when they are discovered within cultivation. So we don't, as botanists or as horticulturists, go around referring to mutation this and mutation that. We usually call them selections. This is a select form of this particular species. And if that mutation arose naturally, and the population of a particular species is reproducing itself in the wild, Sometimes botany will recognize that as a natural subspecies. So don't want to split hairs. I don't have enough hairs to split, but we do have different words for these different mutations. Cultivars, selections, subspecies. These are just forms of a particular species that have a characteristic that is reproducible within a population. The carrot, another root vegetable. Daucus, again, the ancient name for this thing, and Carota comes from what might be very surprising origin. Any of you who are here today, and again, we thank you for joining us, any of you who are here who might have spent any amount of time north of the Florida Panhandle might be familiar with a wildflower called Queen Anne's lace. It is an old field or a pasture or a meadow plant. It was introduced to North America, not native to North America. It is a European plant. It's found throughout Europe. But note that Queen Anne's lace is exactly the same species as carrot, Daucus carota. However, if you were to pull up a Queen Anne's lace from a meadow a little bit north of Florida, this is the carrot that you would find. This kind of spindly, stringy, fibrous, kind of pale cream-colored taproot, storage root. It's not this great big orange stick. If you're familiar with Queen Anne's lace, it, like poison hemlock, like parsley, like cilantro, has these characteristic flat white flower heads. Queen Anne's lace. The carrot, Queen Anne's lace, is very plastic in its genetics, and you can see the rainbow of root colors that have been selected out of populations and have been isolated and named and cultivated with the intent of producing a consistent crop of this particular color of carrot. Cream being, of course, the natural color, just like the parsnip, but purple is not unheard of. Orange, yellow, red, and so on. The carrot, well, yeah. Okay, so we get that there's a lot of flexibility in the pigments that are isolated within the taproot of the carrot. Carrots were brought into cultivation around the southern Caspian Sea, probably about 2,000 years ago, it seems. And the folks that brought them into cultivation would then select for larger and larger and larger taproots, and they would only sow the seeds of the plants that had the larger taproots so that they would get a consistent crop. Does that make sense? They also had the opportunity then to choose their favorite color, taproot. And for whatever reason, in the area around the southern Caspian Sea, their favorite color was purple. And so the eastern, and the carrot was taken then from southern Caspian Sea towards the Orient, and carrots are purple there. You go to a market, you want to buy carrots, your carrots are going to be purple. That's their choice. That was their selection. That is what they preferred, along with, of course, the exaggerated taproot that provides the most amount of starch. So the eastern carrot is purple. It was the Dutch who chose the color of the western carrot. They're the ones who took it upon themselves to get the most nutrient dense, largest, most palatable, least fibrous taproot. And at the same time, they had the ability to choose the color, and they chose orange. Does anyone know why they chose orange? It was intentional. They chose it because it's their national color. It's the color of their royal house. It could have been anything, but we today expect in the West for our carrots to be orange. Moving on up. We'll leave the ground, we'll leave the root system, and we will go skyward. And let's explore what we have done and what plants can do with their stem. So the stem, the above ground portion of a plant, main function is to support the solar panels of the plant. The stem is responsible for getting the leaves the greatest exposure to sunlight possible. And this can be done by making a three-dimensional sculpture where none of the parts overlap and shade each other. This can be done by getting extremely tall so that there is no competition from neighbors. There's all kinds of ways that plants' solar collectors, known as leaves, can be presented to the sun in order to maximize their sugar production. Stems are also the place where buds are formed. And buds are these basically collections of stem cells that can become anything. You can be anything when you grow up, little stem cell. Do you want to be a flower? Do you want to be a leaf? Or do you want to be a branch? So the buds are produced along the stem, and depending on what the plant is requiring, more leaves, turn those buds into leaves. You need another stem to make more room for solar panels. We'll make this bud into a stem. Is it time to flower and reproduce? We'll turn these buds into flowers. So stem is where the buds are produced, and it's also the structural component that presents the solar panels. What stems do we eat? Not too many. Stems tend to be tough because they have to withstand gravity and wind and other physical motion, right? Physical assault. Stems need to be very strong, so we don't eat many, but we do eat the stems of asparagus, but only when they are at their most tender, least fortified state, when they first begin to emerge in the spring. So asparagus used to be an extremely seasonal crop because there's only one spring in the northern hemisphere. Today, you can pretty much get asparagus year-round because it's always spring somewhere. We import from the southern hemisphere, we import from the areas around the northern hemisphere, different latitudes where spring might arrive a little bit later. So we now, thanks to the combustion engine, can have asparagus pretty much year-round, but it's the stem that is found most often in the kitchen. And asparagus, again, a European plant, likes a temperate climate, not a tropical climate. It's not a plant for Florida gardens. It needs those 4 seasons. It needs to overwinter and be triggered to start to grow and produce new stems each spring. Asparagus is one of few perennial crops. Most of our vegetables are produced and die within a certain year, or a seed is planted and the ensuing entire plant is consumed. Like a carrot, you pull a carrot out of the ground and you eat the storage organ. So there's nothing left in the ground to regrow. With asparagus, we just chop the tops off and those roots stay in the ground and can produce a second flush, a second growth. The same root stock can be, tens, 20s of years old that can continue to grow year after year after year. But eventually the stems do mature. They do get very tall. They do get very fibrous and rough and strong and covered in little leaf bases, which can be quite spiny. The leaf bases can be quite spiny. The leaves themselves will branch out into kind of a fern-like, looking quite fern-like, very airy. This strategy allows sunlight to fall on all these little tiny divided pieces of leaf, so they're not really shading their one part of the leaf isn't really shading another part. It's divided into these tiny little hair-like structures. So that's the asparagus. And the Asparagaceae is an entire group of these monocots flowering plants. And if you've ever seen a yucca or a century plant come into flower and it looks like a giant spear of asparagus, there's a reason. They share a common ancestor, and that ancestor had that flowering stem. It had that newly emerging stem form. It looks the same because it basically is. I don't think anyone eats the flowering stems of agave, but I could be wrong. Why didn't we talk about potatoes when we were talking about roots? Did I just forget? Did I forget the world's most famous root? No. Potatoes are actually stem tissue. We know that because potatoes produce buds, and buds are produced on the stem. This just happens to be stem that's modified to stay underground, a special stem, a special kind of stem. A single potato plant grows two kinds of stems, an above ground stem and a below ground stem. And we know it's stem tissue because it has buds. And we know it has buds. Each and every one of you knows that potatoes have buds because this has happened to all of us. Admit it. You have gone to the vegetable crisper and something is leaping out. The buds of this underground stem have activated in a last-ditch effort to try and save its life and become the plant that it wants to be. But for us, we love the carbohydrate that it stores. Potato belongs to a flowering plant group. Here are the potato flowers. Belongs to a flowering plant group called the Solanaceae. And even the genus it belongs to is Solanum. This happens to be the species Solanum tuberosum because it produces this tuber, this underground stem, that it uses for storage, and we use quite a lot for carbohydrate. The Solanaceae really shows how plants can defend themselves because, like I said early on, and I told you it wasn't unimportant, plants are stuck to the ground. They can't run from their enemies. They can't run from things that want to eat them. The Solanaceae is a very poisonous group of plants. It defends itself very well by creating toxins in just about every part of the plant. In the Solanaceae, called the nightshade family, we have belladonna, we have deadly nightshade, we have peppers, which produces another kind of plant defensive chemical. Eggplant is in the Solanaceae, tomatoes are in the Solanaceae. They're also clever in that they can sequester their toxins into certain places like the leaves that they don't want to get eaten, but it might not put any toxins in the fruit because they do want the fruit to be consumed and then crapped out, the seeds inside crapped out later. But anyway, you've probably heard parts of the potato plant that you should not eat. And if a potato is exposed to too much sunlight and it begins to reveal itself as stem tissue and turn green, it might start making those defensive chemicals. And so you're often advised not to eat green potatoes. Moving on, past potatoes and the Solanaceae, we come to a member of the Brassicaceae, the crucifers. Probably the most important member of the Brassicaceae, the crucifers. And it's this poor looking thing, of which there are not that many left in the wild. And, this is it. There's a few that grow on cliffs in Scotland, and as far as wild plants, that's about it. But every continent grows buckets and buckets and truckloads of the same species of brassica. It's called the wild cabbage. It's Brassica oleracea. Oleracea also means you can eat it. The wild cabbage, what we have done to this thing, what mutations we have caused, what mutations we have exploited. We're looking at the wild cabbage here, and you don't even see a stem. Sometimes when you have these plants that might have a biennial life cycle, they spend 1 year lying flat to the ground, so to minimize how much of their above ground part can be eaten. And they store a lot of carbohydrate underground so that the following year they can leap up. Sometimes the stem is just squished down a little bit and becomes almost indistinguishable between root and leaf, but it might just be a thin area of tissue. When the wild cabbage does flower, it bolts, and it bolts skyward rather quickly. And here we can see a photograph on the right of wild cabbage bolting in Europe and going into flower. And you can perhaps begin to see where we're going with wild cabbage and Brassica oleracea and what crops come from Brassica oleracea. The stem, the flowering stem, if it's prevented from reaching skyward, if instead it is mutated and never elongates, we get this mutation called cauliflower, which means stem flower. Cauliflower means stem flower. And this is just the flowering stem bunched up. It never elongates. It never bolts. It just grows this highly unnatural, would never survive in the wild, could only survive in cultivation, arose in cultivation, cauliflower. Here is what's remaining of the stem. This hyper-exaggerated, truncated, mutated mess of what should be a flowering stem. We halt that process, and we roast that process, and steam that process, and mash that process. You know what I mean? Kohlrabi, another Brassica oleracea. And in this case, it's not the flowering stem that's exploited. It's actually that bit of stem that would normally elongate. Kohlrabi is just plain stem, not the flowering stem, but just what would support the flowers. And that's been exaggerated into a form that could not survive in the wild. You're not going to wander into a food forest and discover kohlrabi or cauliflower. It just couldn't survive on its own. Kohlrabi, Brassica oleracea. Broccoli is the same species. Broccoli and cauliflower are the same species as kohlrabi. This is Brassica oleracea. This one's called Italica. And in this case, we allow, or we selected for, a Brassica oleracea that produces flower buds that are delicious, along with some exaggerated support stem. So we eat the flower buds and we eat the supporting stems because those have been selected to be palatable, not too fibrous, acceptable in flavor, not full of defensive chemicals. If there were defensive chemicals in the original, those have been selected out. We have bred out the defensive chemicals, just like we breed out characteristics in dog breeds. If there's a dog breed that's particularly snarly, we only select for those puppies that are not snarly. Do you know what I mean? It's the same kind of selection over generations. If broccoli is allowed to flower, it reveals its brassicaceous nature, making those four-petaled flower, those cross-shaped flowers, that crucifer, that cross-bearing. Here we have a friendly bumblebee in the act of pollinating a cruciferous vegetable. So roots and stems, I think you get it. Familiar vegetables. Vegetable isn't a word that exists in botany. Vegetable is a culinary word because vegetable doesn't refer to anything in particular. Could be root, could be stem, could be leaf, could be flower bud. It just means that you can eat it and it won't kill you. We looked at this concept of plant families. We talked about a plant that flowers in 2 years, 1 year storing up food, the second year flowering. We talked about mutations and varieties and selections and cultivars basically being the same kind of thing. Takes on, it's a take on a theme, and how breeding and cultivation and selection and crossbreeding and intentionally manipulating the plant's plastic genome has led to the foods that we have today. We saw the amaranth family, beetroot and spinach, the Apiaceae family, including carrots and parsnip, the asparagus family, which includes hosta, believe it or not, and agave. And again, just because we have brought one or two members of one of these families into cultivation, that shouldn't suggest that every member of that family automatically has culinary applications. It might take hundreds, if not thousands, of generations if it were decided to bring something into cultivation to make that something palatable. The Brassicaceae includes the crucifers, the cruciferous vegetables, radishes, and brassica, and the deadly nightshade family, the Solanaceae. We'll do leaves. Leaves, of course, pretty straightforward. Leaves are going to be the one thing of the plant that gets eaten the most by the most organisms. Leaves are out there. They are thin. They have to be flexible. They have to be produced in abundance. They have to be easily replaced. All those things for the benefit of the plant. Now, for the benefit of the herbivore, all those processes also take place. They are thin, they are at eye level, they are out above ground, they're out in the sun, they're produced in abundance, and they're replenished. Those are all good things for herbivores as well. So leaves are always under attack, and we attack them in the salad bowl most often. And the most leaves we consume probably belong to the following: cabbage. Oh, look who it is. Cabbage, Brassica oleracea. This is just broccoli. This is just cauliflower. It's the same plant. Only this time we've got a cultivar, we've got a selection, we've got a variety that grows its leaves in on themselves in a very unnatural and unsustainable configuration into this sphere of completely useless leaves. Useless to the plant, but useful for us because those leaves haven't been exposed to the weather, haven't been exposed to sun, haven't fortified themselves, haven't made themselves tough and waterproof and predator proof. They're nice and soft and pliable, and we love them. Most people, some people, coleslaw. Collard greens, probably the most leaf-like. Anybody makes collard greens like I do, it takes a little processing and it takes a lot of cooking. These are Brassica oleracea, closest to the wild form. Collard greens grow most like the wild cabbage, and the leaves are tough. They are weatherproof. They are predator proof. They need to be parboiled. The stem needs to be taken out because it's too fibrous. You need to throw some fat back or some hog jowl in there with them. Cook them overnight. And then they're delicious. Kale is just a frilly collard green. And it's just wild cabbage. It's wild cabbage with a little flair, a little frizz, a little texture. It's important to note that we're talking about a lot of these different varieties and cultivars of the same species. These are all the results of a breeding program. For whatever reason, people liked the look of kale and selected for kale because it's crispy, crinkly, textured, as opposed to collard greens, which are the same thing. We've got hundreds of different cultivars, even of just cabbage. You can get cabbage in any variety of mutation, configuration, color, shape, all that. It always begs the question, is one of these better for you than another? Do any of them have more of whatever we eat them for than another? And I have queried my colleagues, and no, nothing discernible. There is no discernible difference between an orange carrot and a purple carrot. There's no discernible difference between dinosaur kale and crispy purple frilly. No, there's really no measurable difference in their nutritional value. What's important is just eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Brassica oleracea, given the opportunity to flower, but then having its lateral branches truncated into little knots, is called Brussels sprouts. They're not seedling cabbages. It's a different part of the plant. These are stem buds that have been mutated to grow in on themselves along the stem. And if you've never seen Brussels sprouts growing, well, now you have. Starts out looking very much like cauliflower or kale. And then when it elongates its stem to begin to flower, trying to produce some lateral flowering branches, those lateral branches are then mutated into this club-shaped, fist-shaped, unnatural, unsustainable infolding of growth, and you get the Brussels sprouts growing along what would be the flowering stem. Moving on from cabbage, another probably our most famous or most favorite leaf crop is lettuce. Lactuca sativa. And again, sativa, it sates your appetite. It's satisfying. Sativa means you can eat it. Lactuca, that lacto suggests milk. And that's for a reason. Wild lettuce, Lactuca, in the wild, the one that was taken into cultivation, if you were to break one of the leaves, it would leak milky sap. It's a sunflower. Lettuce is. Here are lettuce flowers. They look something like dandelions. Within the sunflowers, they're actually quite close to the dandelions. Separate from, but you can see the familial resemblance there, little cheerful dandelion flowers. Romaine lettuce is closest to the wild Lactuca sativa. And romaine still produces a little bit of milky sap, latex. And people with a latex allergy find eating romaine lettuce quite difficult. as compared to some of the other cultivars, selections of Latuca sativa, that don't produce the latex, the milky sap. Iceberg, do you honestly think this could survive in the wild? No. Look at it. Just look at it. We're talking about leaves. Let's talk about celery. I thought celery was a stalk. I thought it was a stem. No, it's a fortified, exaggerated leaf. The celery stem, the celery stalk. The stalk is actually part of a leaf. And you can see in a celery bunch, the stem is just this thin layer down here that was severed from the roots. And when celery matures, it grows, it elongates, and it flowers. And we just eat the leaf bases. There is a form of celery, there is a cultivar, a variety that produces a storage root that humans have exaggerated into a thing that we called celeriac. And if you're not familiar with celeriac, you should get familiar with celeriac. It's only available seasonally. The bulbs should be probably as large as your fist, maybe a little bit larger, and firm. These are peeled, chopped, steamed or boiled, and mixed with butter. And you're welcome. Celery and celeriac are in that group that includes Queen Anne's lace with the flat top white flowers, carrots, parsley, cilantro with that white flat topped, called the APAC is this family. Many APAC means the very fragrant family, and they do. They have quite a lot of fragrant parts. Their leaves are quite fragrant. See cilantro, see parsley. Their seeds also contain aromatics. These are celery seeds, and we know that we use celery seeds as a spice. Now, spices, that's another presentation. We can go an hour on spices. If you tune into our YouTube channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Pinellas County Extension, and if you wanted to pursue an hour on spices, please do help yourself. It's fascinating. It deals with these defensive chemicals that plants produce to try and scare us off, and we just can't get enough of them because they're so delicious. On the subject of seeds, aside from spices, the seeds of one group of flowering plants, the grasses, have their own name. The seeds of the grasses are referred to as grain. And many grasses have been brought into cultivation for their seeds, for their grain. So rice, corn, help me, rye, I think. Anyway, grain is the seed of a grass. And there's many different, oats, that's better. Now we're getting somewhere. Barley. Perhaps we'll do an hour on grains someday and why some people can't eat them. Well, short answer, because plants don't want you to eat their seeds. That's their children. Don't eat my offspring. Anyway, back to leaves. Leaves, the powerhouse, the solar collectors. Who's this? Spinach. It's not lettuce. It's not cabbage. It's spinach. Spinacea oleracea. Oleracea we remember as a specific epithet for Brassica oleracea. Spinacea, Italian in origin. Linnaeus borrowed the local name to give to the genus Spinacea. Onions are not roots. They are leaves. Each layer of an onion is a layer of leaves. And in this case, the leaves are used for storage. And in the onions and all of their friends, all their kin, special chemistry, special defensive chemistry that's meant to irritate the eyeballs of anything that tries to take its stored carbohydrate. So what we're seeing here, the stem is squished down into a little layer here. Beneath the stem are the roots. And growing out of the stem, just like most plants, growing out of the stem are these leaves, these storage leaves that fold in. And when it's time to flower, the stem elongates through the center of the onion and produces a beautiful flowering stalk. Is that enough? Are y'all okay? Are you still there? Let's finish up with fruit, and then I'll let you go and enjoy this beautiful day. Fruit, botanically speaking, is the ripened ovary of a flowering plant. So flowering plants make fruit. I told you most of the plants outside your window are flowering plants. Most of the plants outside your window are flowering plants. The oak trees, the grasses, the lawn, the vines, the Spanish moss, all that stuff. They're all flowering plants, and they all make fruit. Only about 0.002% of the flowering plants known on Earth produce a fruit that we can eat or do eat or have bothered eating. The rest of the fruit is made for the plant's reproduction. Its fruit is a method to get the seeds that are inside that fruit far away from the parent plant. We only, like I said, we only utilize like 0.02%. The rest of the flowering plants that make fruit make them dispersed using other mechanisms and not our digestive system. Let's use the tomato as our representative flowering plant. We have the tomato flower. Within the flower, there is this nascent ovary that contains these special cells called ovules. After pollination comes fertilization of those ovules, and those ovules then begin to grow into seeds. And the ovary grows into a fruit. And the ovary grows to protect the seeds within the fruit. That's what makes flowering plants flowering plants. All flowering plants have these parts. These parts are absent in the conifers. Conifers don't have flowers and ovaries. Ferns don't have flowers and ovaries. Mosses don't have flowers and ovaries. This tomato is showing us what all the flowering plants have. This immature ovary, after fertilization, everybody starts to grow up, the fruit matures, and we end up with the seed dispersal mechanism known as the fruit. And in the Solanaceae, we've got these fruits. We've got the tomato, pepper, aubergine, chili peppers, tomatillo. These all just belong to the same family. They're different species, they're different genera, but they all produce this fruit. And it's why we don't use the word vegetable in botany. It's just too woolly. We do use the word fruit in botany, and that refers to the ripened ovary with the seed inside. In the rose family, we've got rose hips. We've got the stone fruits like the peaches and plums. We've got apples in the rose family. We've got raspberries in the rose family and strawberries in the rose family. So again, all these plants are put together the same way. Their flowers are put together the same way, but that doesn't mean that every single member makes the same kind of fruit. These are different takes on the same idea. These are all related. They share a common ancestor, but these modern species are quite different to one another, even down to their fruit. The cucurbits, the melons, and gourds, our native North American gourds, our native North American pumpkins and squash, they lost their dispersal mechanism. They're supposed to be eaten by mammoths. They're the only things big enough to eat pumpkins. They're gone. So they only exist anymore thanks to us and thanks to being in cultivation. So a fruit is the ripened carpel of a flowering plant containing seeds. If we're getting too much in the weeds, and if you can't bear the fact that a corn kernel, not an ear, but a kernel of corn is a fully ripened ovary, a single individual fruit, I apologize. If you want to know more about all this crazy stuff, please join us for Advanced Plant Identification, where we explain this, how it works, how we've ended up with this situation, how plants try and trick us. We're teaching Advanced Plant Identification in March 8 to 29. If you join the Burger Creek mailing list, which is free, and we don't sell it, you can keep updated on our offerings. Here's a ripened ovary containing seeds. Wait a minute. Where's the seeds? Well, humans. Remember how we've been toying with things and we mess with things and we make things that are completely unnatural and could not survive in the wild? Cauliflower, I'm looking at you. We have created a plant that cannot reproduce itself. It's 100% dependent upon us to clone it in order to make more. Bananas are flowering plants, and because we can't leave anything alone, we tried to cross one species of banana with another species of banana. This one with pointy leaves and this one with kind of upright and velvety fruit, cross-pollinated and ended up with a mule, a sterile cultivar, a sterile mule that produced a fruit with no seeds inside. And the scientists said, hooray, people will buy that. Look at what the wild fruit has in it. This wouldn't be an easy sell. This wouldn't be a very friendly thing to put in your kid's lunchbox. Those are all seeds. A wild banana is full of seeds because its intention is to reproduce the plant. This mule, this result of the hybridization, was cloned by the billion by offsets, by cutting the pups off the base and replanting them and doing this billions of times. Each plant then flowering, going through the motions and producing this mule of a fruit with no seeds in it. And that clone was called Gros Michel, Big Mike. In the 50s, a disease got into this clone. Of course, these are all the same individual, right? These are just cuttings of the same individual. And that individual was not immune to this disease, and that individual was wiped out. And this cultivar, therefore, was wiped out. Thanks to breeding programs, another mule arose, and this mule was called the Cavendish. A couple of years ago, the disease began in this cultivar, in this clone, and now we're going to have to come up with a new cultivar because we are losing Cavendish. We will lose Cavendish. It has got the disease and it is not resistant to that disease. So what happens next? They keep breeding. We've got all these existing cultivars. We have existing cultivars, but they don't appeal to the mass market. So there's no money really in growing them because people don't want a little banana. They don't want one that isn't yellow. They don't want one that's going to have a brown spot on it. They want a banana that looks exactly like what they're used to. So the race is on to try and come up with a new cultivar that will meet all those people's needs. But if I were you, I would get used to eating, perhaps try something new. Try a different cultivar of banana. See what you think. Try some of these quote-unquote exotic fruits. Support the industries that grow these plants that are closer to the wild, more likely to be able to take care of themselves in the absence of us. Try something new is our takeaway for today. So you probably saw quite a few vegetables and fruits today that you were familiar with. And see how much you already knew just by virtue of handling these things. And now you've drawn a line between, oh, a flower turns into that and becomes this. And this is related to that. And now I see why. See how easy all this is? I hope. There's still tons and tons and tons more to learn. Like, if a fruit is a ripened ovary with the seeds on the inside, how come the seeds are on the outside of a strawberry? They're not. Join us for Advanced Plant ID and we'll talk more about that. We have a quick closing poll for today's presentation, and then I'll leave you to enjoy your afternoon. In the meantime, while you're filling out that, I will open up what looks like a very robust chat.
So for this last poll, you can go ahead and answer question number 1. It's just to rate today's program. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know. Question 2 and 3 go hand in hand. Question 2 is to rate your knowledge on the subject before today's presentation, while question number 3 is to rate your knowledge of today's subject after this presentation. I'll give everybody a few more moments to fill out these polls, and then again, we will let you go and enjoy this beautiful, wonderful weather we're having.
Thanks so much for your attention today. If you do have any questions, comments, or complaints, I'm not sure what time it is. Gosh, I've gone a little bit too late. So again, thanks for joining us. If you do have any questions, comments, or complaints, please do not hesitate to reach out. My email address is here on this slide.
All right, and I don't see too many questions. James, are you feeling okay with getting outside?
I think that sounds like a great idea. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your week and stay well and stay full of your kitchen botany. All right. Have a good day, guys.